all all of that comes along with the fact that this company culture, right? Our policies have to align with the culture, not only the culture we have, but the culture we want. So if you're trying to fix things in your company culture today that aren't quite going the way you want, then you need to make sure that you have it set for what do we want these policies and processes to be to have the right employee experience in the future. The third piece that reason for an employee handbook is you want to set expectations. This is really important, especially as your organization grows and not everybody in the company is reporting just to one person. You have to have alignment across the organization on what the expectations look like and what does success really mean. And your employee handbook, now, if you just download it off the internet or take a template and fill it in, it's not going to get you here. But spending time thinking about why are your policies the way they are and looking at, do they really align with the values you want, and are your policies the right policies, can change how your culture runs and how people perceive those expectations to be in the future. And it becomes really important when you have more than one leader in the organization. The last two pieces of why handbooks matter, first of all, is your HR processes. Oftentimes when we're going through a client's handbook, we find that what their handbook says and what they do are two different things. And part of what you're trying to teach in your handbook is, here's how you as a new hire can operate as an employee in this company. Here's how you get things done related to your employment. And so you need that to be really clear, and you need it to be accurate. And then the last piece is a really great employee handbook creates employee satisfaction. Now, I am not here to tell you that we're going to like jazz up an employee handbook so much that it is fun to read, but the reality of it is, if you think about how your policies are written and whether they're in concert with the values that and the way you want people to feel at work, it starts to set the tone. And in many companies, and in companies the way it should be, right? Your employee handbook is one of the first pieces of information you get in your onboarding process. And employees that have worked for great employers before read it. And if it's either just a hot mess or it has policies that you're like, ooh, like, why do they do that? Even if those policies aren't what you actually do, you've left a poor taste in the new hire's mouth. And so you have to be really careful and make sure that you've got a handbook that is reflective of the employee experience that you actually want. All of that while you also make sure you're doing really legal stuff. So let's talk a little bit about why your policies matter, because a handbook isn't just the legal piece. It's really about how do I operate as an employee and what can I expect? One of the first reasons that policies matter is actually a competition for talent. And this comes from a couple of different places. One is, right, the policies you create, your PTO policies, your benefit policies, all of these are things that if you're competitive, you can market so that you get better talent. The other reason that they're really important, and I hear this from candidates all of the time, is when you go to work for a small business, even if you love the idea of working in a smaller organization, when all of a sudden somebody says to me, they were a really small business, Kitty, you wouldn't even believe it, but they didn't even have a handbook, right? Like, they want to work for a small business. They don't want to work for a company that feels like a small business or acts like a small business. They want to know that somebody's trying to do this right. And so when you have a strong employee handbook, first of all, you have policies that retain great talent, but also you ensure that that new hire comes in going, oh, this company's got their act together. And that can make a huge difference in new hire retention. The other reason it matters is this is where we start to set expectations for cultures. Really great handbooks don't just say, here's the policy. They actually talk about why the policy is what it is. I'll use an example. A couple of years ago, I had a client that needed an employee handbook. They had about 80 employees and they had never had an employee handbook. They'd been in business at least 10 years. And when I asked, like, why is this your first employee handbook? They said, well, honestly, we kind of had to twist the owner's arm because the owner doesn't like rules. I said, interesting. They were in an industry that was really heavily reliant on like compliance mattered. And I thought, well, that's an interesting mix. Somebody that doesn't like rules but is in the compliance space seems like it doesn't work really well. And so I asked the question. They said, oh no, Katie, that's different. Compliance is law and laws matter. And he cares a ton about laws. He doesn't like rules. And I was like, all right. So their culture, when you walked into their office, their culture had like their key like statements and things like, what did it feel like to work here, painted on their wall. And those statements were places you read them and you were like, this is a place I would love to work. This is an amazing culture. But underlying it was this like, well, if we put it in a book, it'll feel like a rule. And so when we wrote the opening to their handbook, I actually customized a section for them that said, here's the thing. We absolutely believe in laws. Laws matter. Laws should always be followed, and you should never look for the loophole in the law, right? The law matters. Rules that don't make sense are not good. So instead, we are giving you guidelines and basically we're giving you guardrails. And so we explained the handbook as these are the guardrails so that everybody understands. We described it as bumper bowling, right? We all know we have to hit the 10 pins at the end. This guardrails keep any one person from going too far to the left or too far to the right on how they go about hitting those 10 pins, so that you at least know where you're aiming. But there's a lot of different ways to get there, and we allow for a lot of flexibility along the way. That was essentially their opening paragraph. And it told people right off the bat, here's what you can expect. The other piece we put in there was a whole section. I did focus groups with their new hires that had started in the past 2 years. And I asked them, what's something that you wish somebody had told you on day one, that by the time you got to 6 months, you were like, man, if somebody just told me that, this would be so much easier, because they talked about how hard it was to onboard with this company. And so what we came up with was a whole page of tips from the team that were things that, like, one of them was it was a really smart company. You had to be really intelligent to work there because of the kind of business they were in, but they were all used to being top in their class and the smartest person in the room. So they said by 6 months, you felt really nervous about whether you were succeeding because you were overwhelmed and you were no longer the smartest person in the room. And so tips from the team said, look, there's going to be times in the first 6 months where for the first time in your life, you don't feel smart enough. And just know we've all been there too. So come talk to us about it. It was that easy to like bring their culture to life. So a new hire was like, oh, good to know. I won't feel that way, but good to know. And then when they were at month 3 and they felt that way, they had something to go back to be like, oh, this is what they were talking about along the way. Great policies reduce turnover because 1, they're clear, and 2, right, you don't have to terminate people for things. And more importantly, people know what to expect and they decide whether or not those are like the guidelines they're willing to play in. This one I think is really interesting though, particularly for those of you who work for independently owned businesses. You often overlook an employee handbook in terms of the impact it has on the value of the business. So every good business owner is always trying to build a sellable business. It does not mean they're ever planning to sell it, but if it's not sellable, then it means the business doesn't run without the owner in the middle of it. And nobody wants to work for that business, right? So you have to be able to sell your business, even if you never want to. One of my favorite and yet heart-stopping stories comes from a client a few years ago who called us in a panic and said, Katie, we need an employee handbook. They'd never worked with us before. We need an employee handbook. I'm like, okay, tell me what's your why. I know why you do, but tell me why. They were about a $3 million company. They had gotten a proposal from another business to sell the business for about $9 million. And they started down the due diligence path and they said, please send us your handbook and your job descriptions and all of these things. And the business did not have it. And they said, we don't have an employee handbook. And the company immediately withdrew their letter of intent because they would not purchase a company that did not have a handbook in place. So a $9 million sale to a very small business owner fell apart in the matter of 24 hours because they didn't have a handbook. So, and the reason that companies care about that is, right, you don't want to be the company that says, you've never had a handbook before, you've never had policies, but I'm going to make you follow mine. That's a hard sell. And so companies will shy away, and it will bring down the value of the business when you're trying to sell. So sometimes in HR, when we need to talk to somebody about why a handbook and your owner's like, ooh, I hate those, talk about it in terms of EBITDA and value of the business. Now, one of the things when we talk about revitalizing your handbook, not just writing it, the first thing you need to do is check for the accuracy of it. Now, this seems really obvious, but the number of times that we have had somebody, like, we ask a question on our first opening call on a handbook about, hey, we saw in your handbook you have this policy. Tell us more about what drives that. And they're like, that's not our policy. I'm like, well, that's what your handbook says your policy is. So the first thing you need to do is just start by looking through it and reading even the most boring of your policies. Do they reflect what is actually happening today? Because you've likely updated your work week for payroll reasons at some point, or you've put in an HRIS system, or you've added roles to the organization. So who somebody's supposed to call if there's a problem has changed. And so the first thing you want to do is make sure your handbook is accurate. There is nothing more dangerous from a compliance perspective than to have a handbook that says this, and then you tell your employees, oh, but we ignore that part. That undermines the entire employee handbook. The other reason it matters is, again, from a new hire perspective, if I sit down with you on day one and say, we're going to walk through the employee handbook together, and I go, oh, but ignore that, and oh, that's wrong. Again, first impressions are everything, and we can't undo that. So this is the first step. A couple of places where we most commonly see inconsistencies between what people are actually doing versus what their handbook says. The first one is work hours. So there's a section in there that's often a boilerplate section of your template that talks about the hours the office is open. And it's usually written really generically and often does not match what you actually want people to do, or it doesn't reflect the fact that there may be two different sides to your organization. Your payroll timing, when is your payroll actually going to run, is one that, again, you've changed at some point from bi-weekly to weekly, and you didn't update this. Your dress code is almost like a lot of times this is inaccurate or inconsistent with what people are actually doing. It might be what you want people to do, but it's not what they're experiencing when they're there. The alcohol policy is an important one. If you say things like no alcohol on the premises, but you know that Friday afternoons, right, you have cookouts and maybe you bring, you allow beer at those. You don't want a handbook that says no alcohol on the premises ever, if that's your practice. A lot of templates start with no alcohol ever, and you want to make sure that everybody would be able to substantiate that. Along those lines, one of the ones that we always check is your weapons policy. Many companies, just out of habit, put in a weapons policy that says, hey, like no weapons on the premises at all. But the owner or the CEO happens to go hunting on Friday afternoons after work, and therefore brings their gun in their car into the parking lot every day, and yet that's not allowed by the handbook. So don't write something people at all levels won't be able to follow. Driving policies is another one, right? If your policy says never talk on the phone unless you're, while you're driving, you want to make sure that your managers aren't calling people when they know they're driving and having conversations anyway. Those are some of the things that can happen. And then performance management. Some companies have very clear step one of the process is a verbal warning, then a written warning. And if it's too rigid and you don't follow it, you can start to have issues. Or if you say you do reviews annually, but you haven't done reviews in 5 years, you don't want to be in that kind of a position, because if somebody calls you out on your handbook or a policy for a wrongful termination, and the attorney could look through and see, well, here's places where this isn't accurate, and here's places where this isn't accurate, it can cause you lots of legal issues as well. Again, often too, you have employees, if you tell me I'm supposed to get a performance review every year and I don't, My conclusion isn't your employee handbook was wrong. My conclusion is my manager doesn't care about me. And that doesn't feel good for people. The PTO approval process is usually all over the map, so make sure you look at this one. Sometimes it doesn't even say I need to get it approved. Sometimes it says like my manager and 3 other people need to approve it. How long in advance it needs approval is often inaccurate or not followed. So these are just some things that as you go through your handbook, read them to see what are we actually telling our new hires and is it accurate for what we want. So that's kind of run number 1 through what you're looking for in the handbook. Again, feel free if you've got questions on any of that, drop those in the chat or we'll talk about them at the end. The next piece of revitalizing your handbook comes in terms of not just what are you doing today, but what's the culture you want for the future. And so this is where the really fun part of handbooks come in is you start to think about, well, what do I want it to feel like to work here? And maybe my policies are accurate, but I'd like to change some of them so that I'm getting better culture outcomes in the future. And so when you do this work, now you may really dramatically rethink what's happening. Couple of things you need to think about as you're envisioning this for future state. First of all, you've got to look at what are your competitors doing. And when you look at your competitors, you have to look not only in your direct market, meaning maybe location, maybe industry, but you also need to think about where might your talent be coming from. So I'll use our landscape clients as an example, right? They historically have written policies like PTO plans and benefit plans to compete in the landscape industry because they mostly hired people from other landscape companies. But as you get bigger, now you start needing roles that aren't traditionally in that industry. Maybe somebody's ready to hire a controller, or they're bringing in a general manager, or they're bringing in an HR person. Well, that person may come from any industry, right? And so now you have to worry about, is your talent going, if it's coming from a different industry, you need to figure out whether or not your industry's competition is as competitive as it needs to be. The same thing goes for Michaela. I know you're in the university space, right? And right, some of those roles are coming from other universities, but some of them are coming from the general marketplace. And so saying we're nonprofit or, hey, we can't do that because can really limit your talent if you don't understand how that meets up with the competition from other markets. And from all of that, what you have to figure out then is what are the best practices? What do we want the culture to look like? What are our competitors doing that we need to be able to match, or at least consider how to work with the fact that maybe we're not as competitive as we would like to be? And where are some of the places that, quite honestly, our HR policies could set us apart without costing us that much more money? So we're going to walk through a couple of key areas of that we think about when we think about the policies themselves, and share with you, here's what we see in the market when we look through a lot of different handbooks, places where you really might think about whether or not you are being competitive in today's market. So first of all, best practices from a time off perspective. This one, a lot of folks that go, oh, what do you mean, Katie? But you need to build a paid time off policy in today's market that is a minimum of 3 weeks of paid time off at all levels. And that's the big shocker for folks. They're like, really, even for entry level people? Now, paid time off could be a combination of your sick leave and your vacation. So you can just put it into one bucket. Some companies, we have some clients that shut down for a week between Christmas and New Year's. If you do, that can be part of the 3 weeks, depending on how it's structured. But if you are not providing people at least the opportunity to take up to 3 weeks off in a year or earn that much, even if they're not taking it, you will find yourself behind the 8 ball. More companies than not are taking a combined approach to paid time off. So they're, instead of having a bucket for sick time and a bucket for vacation time, they've gone to the paid time off single bucket model. One of the things to be careful of in that space is you need to know, and we'll talk about this in a minute, you do need to know your state laws around paid sick leave. Those vary by states as to whether or not they combine appropriately. The ideal best practice in paid time off is that it is an accrual-based program. So I earn it during every pay period. And if you really want to make for a competitive paid time off policy, get rid of anything that is use it or lose it. So companies that say you get 15 days at the beginning of the year, and if you haven't used it by December 31st, you lose it, are often losing out on talent and frustrating their team members. They're also creating more administrative work for themselves. And many times what I also see is I've had companies who have a use it or lose it policy by the end of the year, but the end of the year is their busy season. So they don't really want people taking time off. So their paid time off policy is in like competition for what they need for business need. So an accrual policy that's just a constant accrual, it's a bank that rolls, and there is no beginning or end of the year, it just consistently rolls over, is your ideal setup, both administratively and from an employee experience perspective. Now you can put caps on that so that people don't bank up huge numbers of hours, but that's the easiest and the preferred way to write a paid time off policy. Most importantly, if you give people time off, they have to be able to take it. If you've got long periods of blackout dates or you just, take it off, but you need to actually have, you need to solve the time, you're going to lose good people. I've had some organizations that say, this is what we do for crews. I think I'm okay. This is what we do for our crews, but this is what we do for our office people, what we do for faculty, but staff. There can be reasons to have two different policies, but those policies still need to be equitable, even if they're not exactly the same. And you need to have a good understanding of what that means. I always suggest minimal to no eligibility waiting periods. I had a candidate last week, her new employer made her wait an entire year before she could take a day off. I'm sorry, but life just doesn't work that way for almost anyone. And to not be able to take time when you need it is either not accept your jobs or go fairly quickly somewhere else. She stayed the entire year. She was quitting at like 11 out of 12 months. So now she was going to a new company and she was like, please tell me there's no eligibility waiting period for time off. I need a vacation. So those are things to look for in your policies. Because it wouldn't be right to talk about handbooks without talking about compliance, there are two things that you need to make sure of. First of all, many states have now passed paid sick leave laws, and you need to understand how these work. In some cases, as long as your existing paid time off plan provides enough time to meet the minimum from the state level, you're good to go. Other states, Illinois, for example, is a little bit more robust in like it actually has to be labeled something different, and you need to make sure that you get that down. The other piece to make sure with your PTO plan, some states require you to pay out unused PTO time or pay time off time. Other states do not. And then there's a third batch of states that say, as long as you follow what your handbook says, you can do it any way you want. And so you need to know what the requirement is for your state and make sure that you are being consistent with those laws. So those are some best practices with paid time off. We do often get questions around unlimited paid time off, and like that sounds really cool. I will tell you, many companies that have tried unlimited paid time off are actually walking away from it because it was counter-effective for people. You gave unlimited time off, and so nobody ever felt like they actually took a day off, and therefore they never stepped completely away. So they can actually backfire and burn employees out. I laugh that when I started my business, I was like, I now have unlimited paid time off. This will be fabulous. And I take far less days off than I ever did when I worked for a corporation and had to put in like my own PTO time. So let's talk about holiday best practices. And sometimes we go, like, we take this for granted if you're in an organization that has a really good holiday program, but it's a really important part and something we often see in employee handbooks that isn't as robust as it could be or should be. So first of all, there's a minimum of 5 paid holidays that we consider to be best practices. They're not required by law. And if you've always worked someplace where you get paid holidays, you take this for granted. So it's really important that you take a look at it. Also, make sure your handbook actually explicitly states these are paid days off. Some companies say, like, we have these holidays, but they don't actually say whether or not they're paid. So make sure you follow that. We suggest as best practices, making sure that your paid holidays apply to both your exempt and your non-exempt employees and even your seasonal employees. In the landscape industry, we often see that people are either their seasonal employees are not getting paid holidays, or you have to be there one full season before you get them. I will tell you, in today's market for staffing, which is already competitive and about to get more competitive, you really need this as a way to sort of ensure that your folks, especially you get somebody new in the first year, you don't, if they're good, you don't want them to leave and go somewhere else. So the paid holiday is a great way to make that a nice benefit. Our general rule of thumb is if the office is closed, people should get paid. So for example, we have clients that shut down for the week between Christmas and New Year's, but we have some clients that pay for that and some that don't. My rule of thumb is if the employee doesn't have a choice on whether or not to work that day, then you should be paying them for that day off. Anything shy of that makes you not competitive and you're going to lose people in the market. And I know, again, some of you are like, well, of course, Katie, and yet this is not a standard in the in other companies. Also, we strongly suggest if the holiday falls on a weekend, you give either the day before or the day after as the holiday. So 4th of July is often known for this, right? Every couple of years, it's either on Saturday. I think this year it was on a Saturday. And some of our clients said, oh, it falls on Saturday. Nobody gets any time off. It's a really easy way to just make your employees feel like they don't matter. And so people will get frustrated and start looking other places. Some of the ones that most, when I say what should be in your pay, in your holiday pay, it's the day after Thanksgiving. Martin Luther King Jr. birthday is another one to start thinking if you're trying to like enhance your holiday pay. The day after Thanksgiving is always a nice one to give. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday in the winter is starting to become more popular. Juneteenth, this especially last year, we saw a lot of companies that added this. It's now a federal holiday, so it's starting to get added. And then one of the other best practices we've suggested people do is offer either floating holidays or what we've referred to here at People Solutions Center as heritage days. These are days that folks can take as a paid holiday, but they can choose when they want to take them. So for example, if somebody has a religious holiday that they like to take, if they're in the Jewish community and they need Rosh Hashanah off, or Yom Kippur off, then they can use those days for those. If somebody really likes to take their birthday off, great. They have a floating holiday to do that. So giving them the opportunity to take them for a lot of different things. Here, I tell everybody you get 2 heritage days a year, and take them for whatever you want. One of my personal heritage days is St. Patrick's Day, and my other one is home opener of baseball. To me, they are important to my family. So they are my heritage, even if the federal government does not think they should be paid holidays. But it's kind of a fun way to say to people, like, we get you're human and your holidays may not be my holidays. And so those are important ones to kind of keep on your radar. Other time off is a key piece to think about as you talk about your employee handbook. These are some trends that we're seeing that we're finding make a big difference in retention for folks. First of all, your bereavement leave policy. We always suggest, we think most companies have bereavement leave of like, you get 1 day if your spouse dies. I'm sorry, but this is one of those crazy things, right? If you lose a close family member, you probably shouldn't be at work the next day or even 3 days after. You need time to work through that. And the reality of it is, if I don't do that and take good care of you, then you start running into like people being like, wow, my worst moment, and you didn't help me out. Also, bereavement is one of the least commonly abused policies out there. There's this old myth that like, oh, they had 5 grandmothers that died, but the reality is most people don't make up. If they're happy at their company, they're not making up that they lost somebody important in their life. And how do we know like what people actually need? So give up to 5 days. You will find most people never take all 5 days, and they simply like they have them and they feel good about the fact that they existed. Um, I also suggest if you can get it past everybody, right, and get it approved, don't bother distinguishing between immediate family and extended family, because who's in my family may not be how you define family. But you know, my grandmother may not be, might be the person that raised me. So who are you to say like what title qualifies? So just putting out there up to 5 days for family members is really an easy way to not have to break your own policy. This is one of the places where we often see organizations, we do have hearts. So something happens to somebody, we know it's somebody they're close to, we're like, oh my gosh, just take what you need. Well, that's great, and it's what you should say. But if you have a really strict policy in your handbook, then you've just undermined your entire employee handbook. This one was one that came to our attention. It actually was a request from an employee. And the moment I saw it, my heart stopped, that it had never occurred to me. But if you are somebody who has ever lost a child, a miscarriage is a death in your family. And most companies do not explicitly call this out as time off for bereavement, but it's the first thing you would do. If somebody told you they had a miscarriage, you'd be like, oh my gosh, take whatever you need. So allowing time for that and just calling it out. Again, even if nobody ever uses it, the impact that has to your employees to say like, oh, you see me and you understand that things can happen in life can go a long way. So those are a couple things on best practices around bereavement. I'm going to cover jury duty, and then we've got a question that I'll circle back to on the holiday piece of it. So jury duty, this section of it in handbook always makes me laugh. It's also one of the inconsistencies. A lot of times people's handbook will say either you must pay us the money that you like, we'll pay you, but only if you give us your check from the jury duty. Almost nobody's doing that. Or people don't know that their policy says we're not going to pay you for jury duty, and they're paying people anyway, which you should pay people for jury duty. You need to make sure we're supporting our legal system. So our best practice is to pay for jury service. Do not require them to return court pay. I served on a jury for 10 days this summer, and I think I got $13 a day. I had to be downtown St. Louis. I could not go home for lunch. Didn't really have a great option for bringing my lunch. And it cost me easily $13 a day to get lunch at a decent place. So the administrative duties of like recovering that check and how cheap you look when you do it is not worth just saying, we appreciate you doing your service as a citizen of the United States. But check your policies, because you might be surprised at what they actually say versus what you thought they should say. So let me grab a couple of questions that came in. So the first one, regarding holidays and the suggestions of having minimum of 5 pays. What if the work season doesn't span over the holidays? That is a great question. Typically what we suggest is you might want to think about then using the floating holidays as options. If it's seasonal, you might just say, look, we're going to give you this many floating holidays. I think it also depends on how long your season is. If your season is the majority, like I'll use landscaping as an example, right? You've got April to November-ish, depending on the part of the country you're in, is typically high season. And then folks are off during the holiday space. I would say certainly make sure that you've got you cover all the holidays that happen during the season and pay even your seasonal folks for those. And maybe what you do then is for your folks that return more than one season, give them floating holidays for the holidays that they would otherwise miss. That's kind of a way to make it equitable for your seasonal folks and encourage them to return a second year. And then bereavement leave is suggesting paid leave. I absolutely suggest paid leave for bereavement, up to 5 days paid if somebody loses a family member. And here's the reason why. What we find in bereavement is we get a lot of pushback when we say put up to 5 days of paid bereavement leave in your policy. Everybody is like, oh my gosh, that's too much. That's too much. And yet the minute one of their team members has somebody that they loses somebody close to them, a family member, a spouse, a sister, a mom, dad, grandma, right? The first thing we say, because we are human beings with heart, is, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Take whatever you need. And now you've set it up for like, well, do I take whatever I need? Paid, unpaid? What should I expect? Also for your team members who aren't even impacted, if I've had situations where somebody on a team like lost their spouse, right? And it's like, well, you can take time off. The first thing their team members want to know is, are they okay? And are they going to get paid? Because if they're not getting paid, I'm really worried about them. And you don't want to be the employer that's sitting back going, oh, sorry, we don't pay you for that. So put it in your handbook, let everybody know what the policy is, and then you're not undermining that handbook when things happen, because you're probably going to lead with your heart in the moment anyway. You might as well just write it into your policy. And the paid jury duty, I absolutely suggest that the paid jury duty be for both your hourly and your salaried employees. And here's the reason why. God forbid anything ever happened to one of us and we're on a jury, you want people on your jury, you want people to serve and to want to serve. And if you are an hourly employee, it's very possible that not getting paid those days could be even more impactful to how you live. And so we need to support, my perspective is we need to support the social justice system. And if we don't pay people, they won't go for jury duty. I will also tell you, there used to be a myth out there of if you just tell the court that, hey, I don't get paid if I'm here, you would automatically get excused. And based on the experience I just had, I don't know that that is necessarily true anymore. So you might truly have people who don't have a choice but to serve, and you can yet can't afford to go without pay for those days. So well, you might as well just do the right thing on the front end. Great questions. All right, so let's talk about parental leave. Some companies have started to ask us, beyond just maternity leave, what should leave look like for parents? Both the mother and the father and other individuals involved in the child's life. First of all, we always suggest that you have a short-term disability policy. And this isn't just for maternity situations, but the reality is if somebody on your team were to get sick, you're going to, again, we're all going to lead with heart, and we're going to be like, we've had clients who've had employees who are diagnosed with cancer. And your immediate reaction is, oh my gosh, do what you need to do, take what you need to take. And that's the right answer, except when all of a sudden that's 4, 5, 6 weeks, as an employer, how do you go back and say, well, I meant that, but I didn't really mean it for this long, right? That's an awkward conversation. Your short-term disability plans have parameters and guidelines in place. So you're paying for it in advance so that when you need it for one of your team members, it's already there. You have to follow the rules. You can't make up your own rules or you lose the policy. So you don't have to feel like a bad person. Instead, you say, you know what, we've got this policy in here to protect you. This is what it does. Here you go. I've taken good care of you. And now you feel like a good human. And at the same time, the employee has coverage, but you're not likely to undermine your policies along the way. So short-term disability covers especially in maternity leave situations, right? The portion of maternity leave that is because the doctor says you can't come back to work within 6 to 8 weeks, that would be covered under the short-term disability plan. And so if you put this in place, it helps you with this whole parental leave concept. Beyond that, we suggest creating time under a parental policy that is bonding time for both parents. So again, could be not just for mom. The more progressive, I would say the more progressive parental leave policies cover both the mother and the father. and anybody else that is part of that parenting situation, because there are a lot of options for what that can look like. We refer to that as non-birth parents. So that's the easiest way to refer to it. That way you don't get caught up in assuming who is part of that circumstance. That can include adoptive parents. And usually what will happen is what we say is like, right, this is the time you can take off. Some companies will pay for a certain number of weeks. And then if they want to supplement that from their paid time off plan, they can. Some companies will pay 60% for so many weeks, and then you can supplement. So there's a lot of different ways to write this, but making sure that there's something available for both the birth parent and non-birth parent and adoptive parents is really becoming sort of best practice. And if you're competing for talent, this is a particularly important piece. Work from home. I'm going to go through this one a little bit quicker, but we'll make sure we cover the highlights. First of all, obviously, if you're writing it for perfect worlds, most people have a preference for either hybrid or remote. That is not always possible. I tell folks all the time, it's okay. If you can't have work from home, that's all right. The key here is communicate the why. So your handbook shouldn't just say, here's our policy because we said so, but talk here about, here's why our policies are what they are. Here's why if we can't go hybrid, here's why we don't do hybrid. If you're going to do in-person and hybrid space, make sure that the reasons people have to be in are good. I had a client who they required everybody to come in their office on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then everybody sat on Zoom meetings all days on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so they never talked to each other anyway. It really disrupted the environment. Be really clear on your expectations for when, regardless of whether you allow work from home or not. People come now to your workplace with expectations from prior places. So you need to make sure you have a work from home policy in your handbook that is really, really clear and that's equitable across the organization. And again, equitable doesn't mean same. It just means it makes sense based on the differences in roles. Benefits eligibility, there's a couple of key practices here I want to make sure that we talk about. First of all, get rid of probationary period language. If your employee handbook says you have a probationary period, I don't care if you have a waiting period, that's great. Eligibility waiting is fine. Probationary periods can get you into all sorts of trouble with the NLRB. So get rid of the term probationary. Instead, we call them eligibility periods. And I would say your best practice is first of the month following 30 days. Your law, if you're big enough to be covered under the ACA, which many employers are these days, your law says it has to be by the 90th day. Administratively, doing first of the month following 30 days is, first of all, competitive in the market, and second of all, way easier than saying on your 30th or on your 60th day. So make it easy on yourself and stay competitive in the market. Part of the reason 30 days is better than first of the month following 60 is if I've left another employer, I have 60 days to elect COBRA. And so if I have that window, it puts me in a position to make the decision on whether I need COBRA from my prior employer or not. So giving me that shorter eligibility period allows me to transition from one company to the other without risking my in-health coverage in the long run. And then most importantly, make your eligibility periods consistent across all of your benefits, at least across health, dental, medical. If you can't also do 401k in the same eligibility period, some companies can't, but it's really confusing for people if they have like health insurance at 30 days and dental's at 60, this other thing's at 90, your vacation is at 120 days, like just make it consistent along the way. So those are some of our key best practices in terms of how you write your policies. Again, this is a way for you to really think about how do you take things to the next level and create policies that don't just, cover all of the laws, although laws are super important, but how do you actually attract, retain, and build a sellable business for your organization. And so hopefully you found this super helpful in thinking about what's in your handbook and how to think differently about the kinds of policies you need to think. Obviously, you do need to make sure you're covered on compliance. And if you would like copies of these slides, feel free to email us afterwards and Nicole will get those to you. So you have them for follow-up. There are a couple of appendix slides in here that talk about compliance. But also, as a thank you for taking time out of your day to watch this, we do always offer a free HR strategy session. And if you're interested in that for your organization, that's where we meet with you one-on-one and we can talk through some of what are the challenges you're running into from an HR perspective. What are these policies? Like, what policy questions did you have? And we'll come up with some recommendations for what will help you achieve the HR culture that you want as you go forward. Or if there's a business need you have you're trying to solve for, we'll be happy to spend some time with you putting that together. So let me stop there. Are there any questions from anyone that we can go ahead and stop